Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that a government thousands of miles away has tightened its control over your life. It taxes the paper in your home. It taxes the tea in your cup. Its soldiers patrol your streets. And when those soldiers open fire on civilians, justice appears to protect the uniform, not the victims. But here's the mystery. For generations, most American colonists had considered themselves loyal British subjects. They were not originally fighting to create a new country. So what changed? How did 13 separate colonies, divided by religion, geography, wealth, and competing interests, turn against one of the most powerful empires on Earth? Was it really just about taxes? Or was something deeper pushing America toward rebellion? The answer begins not in Boston, Philadelphia, or Lexington, but on battlefields far beyond the colonies, where Britain won a massive war and accidentally began losing America. In 1754, Britain and France were competing for land, wealth, and influence across North America. Their rivalry exploded into the French and Indian War, the North American phase of a much larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. British troops fought alongside colonial soldiers. Together, they defeated France and gained enormous territory. On paper, Britain had achieved a historic victory. But victory came with a hidden price. The war had left the British government deeply in debt. Maintaining troops and defending its expanded empire would require even more money. British officials looked across the Atlantic and reached what seemed to them like a reasonable conclusion. The colonies had benefited from the war. Therefore, the colonies should help pay for it. Simple, logical, and politically disastrous, because the people in London and the people in America saw the empire in completely different ways. Britain believed it was asking for cooperation. Many colonists believed Britain was taking away their rights. That disagreement would become the crack that split an empire. For much of their early history, Britain's mainland colonies had enjoyed considerable freedom. An ocean separated them from London. Communication was slow, enforcement was inconsistent, and colonial legislatures became accustomed to managing local affairs. Colonists elected representatives, debated taxes, passed laws, and controlled local spending. They were still part of the British Empire, but many had developed the habit of governing themselves. That habit changed everything. By the end of the French and Indian War, the colonies were no longer fragile settlements clinging to the Atlantic coast. Their population and economy had grown dramatically. They had newspapers, merchants, lawyers, political leaders, and their own elected assemblies. Then Britain tried to impose tighter control, and suddenly the colonists faced a dangerous question. Were their assemblies real institutions of government, or did they exist only because Parliament allowed them to? What happens when people experience freedom for generations and are then told that the freedom was never truly theirs? In 1763, Britain issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, restricting colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. British leaders hoped the boundary would reduce conflict with indigenous nations and lower the cost of defending the frontier. But many colonists saw something else. They had fought in the recent war. Some expected access to Western land as a reward. Land speculators had invested money in Western claims, while settlers dreamed of new farms and opportunities. Now the British government was telling them to stop. The restriction also exposed a deeper contradiction. Britain had won vast new territory, but many colonists were being prevented from settling it. To British officials, the policy was about stability. To frustrated colonists, it was control. And then came the taxes. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. It changed duties on imported goods and strengthened customs enforcement. Smuggling cases could be tried in vice admiralty courts, where there was no local jury. The money mattered, but the principle mattered more. Colonists believed they possessed the rights of British subjects, including protections against arbitrary taxation and unfair prosecution. Parliament, however, claimed authority throughout the empire. The collision had begun. Then, 1 year later, Britain made a move that transformed scattered frustration into organized resistance. The Stamp Act of 1765 placed a direct tax on printed materials. newspapers, legal documents, licenses, commercial papers, even playing cards. This tax was difficult to ignore because it entered everyday life and affected influential groups, including printers, lawyers, merchants, and political leaders. Colonial anger spread quickly. Protesters organized boycotts. Crowds intimidated stamp distributors. The Sons of Liberty emerged as a powerful resistance network, and a phrase began echoing across the colonies: "No taxation without representation." But this slogan is often misunderstood. The colonists were not simply saying, "We dislike paying taxes." They were saying that taxes should not be imposed without the consent of representatives connected to the people being taxed. Britain responded with the idea of virtual representation. Members of Parliament, officials argued, represented the interests of all British subjects, even those who could not vote and those living across the Atlantic. The colonists rejected that logic. How could lawmakers understand local needs if Americans had not elected them and could not hold them accountable? The dispute was no longer only about money. It was about where political authority came from. And then something unexpected happened. Britain backed down. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act after colonial resistance and pressure from British merchants. Americans celebrated. It seemed that protest had worked, but attached to that victory was a warning. On the same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, announcing that it had the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The tax disappeared. The claim of power remained. This was the trap at the heart of the crisis. Each side believed surrendering the principle would destroy its political future. Parliament feared that retreat would weaken the empire. The colonists feared that submission would reduce them to people who could be ruled without consent. A compromise was still possible, but the space for compromise was shrinking. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, placing duties on several imported goods. Britain tried to frame these as external duties rather than direct internal taxes. Many colonists saw little difference. Money raised from the duties could also help pay royal officials in America. That threatened the influence of colonial assemblies, which had used control over salaries to keep governors and judges accountable. Once again, boycotts spread. Colonial women played a critical role by producing homespun cloth and reducing the use of imported goods. Merchants signed non-importation agreements. Writers filled newspapers with arguments about liberty and constitutional rights. Resistance was becoming part of ordinary life. It was also becoming dangerous. Britain sent troops to Boston. The soldiers were supposed to restore order. Instead, their presence turned the city into a pressure chamber. On March 5, 1770, tension erupted. A confrontation formed between townspeople and British soldiers. Insults were shouted. Objects were thrown. In the confusion, troops fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed. One of them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and indigenous ancestry, who later became one of the best-known victims of the confrontation. Colonial propagandists called the event the Boston Massacre. The name was powerful. The image was even more powerful. Engravings portrayed disciplined British troops firing deliberately into helpless civilians. Copies circulated widely, turning a chaotic street confrontation into a symbol of military tyranny. But then came a remarkable twist. John Adams, a future leader of the Revolution and future president, defended the British soldiers in court. Why? Because Adams believed that even unpopular defendants deserved legal representation and a fair trial. Most of the soldiers were acquitted, while 2 were convicted of manslaughter. That trial revealed a complicated truth. The colonial cause claimed to defend the rule of law, but revolutionary emotion was beginning to move faster than the law itself. By 1773, many of the Townshend duties had been repealed, but Britain kept the tax on tea. It was small, yet symbols do not need to be expensive to become explosive. The Tea Act allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea in the colonies under favorable arrangements. The tea could be cheaper than smuggled alternatives, even with the tax included. So why resist it? Because buying the tea might be seen as accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies. The issue was no longer the price of tea, it was the price of submission. On the night of December 16, 1773, protesters boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was dramatic, carefully organized, and impossible for Britain to ignore. In London, patience ran out. In 1774, Parliament responded with a series of laws that colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts's government came under tighter imperial control. Colonial meetings faced restrictions. British authority expanded its ability to house troops under certain conditions. Britain intended to isolate Massachusetts and make an example of Boston. Instead, it united the colonies. Food and supplies arrived from other regions. Colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They coordinated resistance and asserted that the colonies possessed rights Britain could not simply erase. This was one of Britain's greatest strategic mistakes. Punishment created solidarity. 13 colonies with different economies, cultures, and political interests began recognizing a common threat, but they had not yet declared independence. Many still hoped for reconciliation. That hope was about to meet gunpowder. By early 1775, Massachusetts was preparing for possible conflict. Colonial militias stored weapons and ammunition. British officials decided to seize military supplies at Concord and arrest resistance leaders if possible. During the night of April 18th, British troops marched out of Boston. Warnings spread through the countryside. On the morning of April 19th, British regulars confronted colonial militiamen at Lexington. No one knows with certainty who fired first, but a shot rang out. Then came more gunfire. 8 colonists were killed at Lexington. The British continued to Concord, where fighting intensified. During their return to Boston, colonial militiamen attacked from behind trees, walls, and buildings. By the end of the day, the political dispute had become an armed rebellion. And yet, here's the surprising part. Even after blood had been spilled, many colonists still did not demand complete independence. Today, the American Revolution can feel inevitable. We know the ending, so every tax appears to lead naturally toward the Declaration of Independence. But history did not feel that way to the people living through it. For years, many colonists wanted their rights protected within the British Empire. They protested Parliament, but remained loyal to the king. After fighting began, the Second Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III in July 1775, making a final attempt at reconciliation. The king rejected the appeal and treated the colonies as being in rebellion. Then, in early 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. Paine attacked monarchy itself and argued that an island should not rule a continent. He wrote in direct language ordinary readers could understand, transforming independence from a radical idea into a public possibility. The debate had changed. But here lies the deeper reveal. The American Revolution was caused not by one tax, one battle, or one speech. It grew from a chain reaction. War produced debt. Debt produced taxation. Taxation raised questions about representation. Resistance brought punishment. Punishment created unity. Military occupation produced violence. Violence destroyed trust. And without trust, compromise collapsed. The revolution began when both sides stopped seeing the other as a political partner. Britain increasingly saw resistance as disobedience. The colonists increasingly saw British authority as tyranny. Once those beliefs hardened, almost every action confirmed the worst fears of the other side. But even this is not the entire story. The revolution used the language of liberty, but liberty was not shared equally. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people lived in the colonies. Some sought freedom by supporting the British after British authorities offered emancipation under specific conditions to enslaved people who escaped rebel masters and joined the royal cause. Others served the American side, hoping military service would lead to freedom. Indigenous nations faced their own impossible choices. Many feared that an American victory would accelerate settlement on their lands. Different nations, and sometimes different groups within the same nation, made different alliances based on survival, diplomacy, and local circumstances. Women supported boycotts, produced supplies, managed farms and businesses, carried messages, and in some cases participated directly in the conflict. Yet they remained excluded from formal political power. Even among white colonists, opinion was divided. Some became revolutionaries. Some remained loyal to Britain. Others tried to stay neutral and were pulled into the conflict anyway. This was not simply America against Britain. It was also a civil war within American communities. Neighbors distrusted neighbors. Families divided. Homes and property were confiscated. Thousands of loyalists eventually left. The birth of the United States was inspiring. It was also violent, uncertain, and deeply complicated. So what truly caused the American Revolution? Taxes helped ignite it, but taxes alone do not explain it. The deeper cause was a struggle over power. Who had the right to govern the colonies? Could Parliament tax people who had elected no members to it? Were colonial assemblies subordinate institutions, or legitimate governments representing their communities? Could an empire survive if its people held completely different definitions of representation and liberty? Britain attempted to strengthen its authority after 1763. The colonists interpreted that effort as an attack on rights they believed they already possessed. Each protest led to a stronger response. Each response inspired greater resistance. And step by step, reform became rebellion. Rebellion became war. And war made independence imaginable. The revolution was not created by famous men alone. It was shaped in crowded taverns and quiet kitchens, in newspaper offices and merchant warehouses, on farms, docks, roads, and frozen streets. It grew through arguments, boycotts, fear, ambition, sacrifice, and anger. And its greatest lesson may also be its most unsettling. Revolutions do not usually begin with a declaration. They begin when people lose faith that the system will hear them. They grow when power answers criticism with punishment. And they become unavoidable when both sides believe surrender is more dangerous than conflict. In 1776, the colonies declared themselves free. But the argument beneath the revolution never truly disappeared. Who holds power? Where does authority come from? And what should people do when their government no longer seems to represent them? Those questions transformed 13 colonies into the United States of America, and centuries later, they are still being asked. The American Revolution did not begin because tea was expensive. It began because an empire and its colonies could no longer agree on what it meant to be free. If history is not simply about what happened, but why it happened, subscribe for the next documentary.